in um, recognizing that we are in a time of so much intensity and fragmentation and displacement and violence that's impacting us and our communities nearby and globally. It feels especially salient that we are inside of this work of like building the alternatives and really shaping the future, the desired futures that we want. So shout out to all the builders who are, you know, creating and developing land trust and farms and community clinics and co-ops and freedom schools, these alternative institutions and infrastructure that reflect the world that we want to build for ourselves and for those who will come after. So grateful that we have this space to learn, to support our organizing and bring our collective visions into reality. And yeah, curious how many folks, is this your first time participating in a Soulfire workshop? Or some who are returning? Welcome back. Yay, yay, yay. I see the reactions. Yeah, welcome to all of you. We are an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm, and our mission is to uproot racism and seed sovereignty in the food system. And part of that is this each one teach one work and passing on the skills and knowledge that we need to have more dignity in our relationship with food and land. So we're going to get into it. I'm going to invite my teammates to introduce themselves, and I'll introduce our featured presenters. You're also welcome to say hello and introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already. You're welcome to share your name, your pronouns, the lands that you're zooming in from, and anything that lights you up about your land projects. Throughout our time together, please stay muted unless you're being called on. There'll be some moments to speak, but the chat is our space to engage. So feel free to fill the chat up with questions, comments, ideas, resources. That space is ours to use. Okay. Closed captioning is available by clicking on show captions if you need that. And if you have any questions that come up, Jazz and I are happy to answer those related to tech if you're having any trouble. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my teammate Jazz to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jazz. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the administrative program manager here at Soulfire, and I'm going to be holding down tech today. So if you have any questions or needs, feel free to message me, and I'll also be in the chat too. So thanks for being here, and I'll pass it back to you, Naima.
Thanks, Jazz, for all your support. So now I have the honor to introduce our presenters. First, I want to lift up Athena Bernkopf, who is a cross-pollinator tending to the intersecting roots of Black and queer liberation, land, housing, and healing justice. Athena was raised in Bed-Stuy, New York, and their work as an organizer and facilitator has taken them across New York City in roles as anti-gentrification paralegal case handler at the Legal Aid Society, a core member of the Audre Lorde Project's Third Space Wellness Collective, and project director of the East Harlem El Barrio Community Land Trust. Athena currently serves as Sustainable Network Steward at Wild Seed Community Farm and Healing Village, where they're facilitating a process to implement enduring land tenure and collective governance structures for housing and land stewardship. Thank you, Athena. They've also been a member of the Oasis Solidarity Collective, cultivating popular education-based learning spaces that deepen capacity for consensus-focused solidarity economy formations. And Athena continues to support strategies for strengthening and expanding the scale of solidarity economies as a board member of the Cooperative Economics Alliance of New York City. Driven by a vision of cityscapes abundant and ancient trees, taller and more common than skyscrapers, Athena is committed to co-creating liberated futures rooted in mutual care, collective stewardship of resources, and being in right relationship with land. Welcome, Athena, and thank you so much for your devoted service. And our other presenter is Leah Penniman, who uses all pronouns. Leah is a Black Creole farmer, mother, soil nerd, author, and food justice activist from Soulfire Farm. She co-founded Soulfire in 2010 with a mission to end racism in the food system and reclaim our ancestral connection to land. As co-ED and farm director, Leah is part of a team that facilitates powerful food sovereignty programs, including farmer training for Black and Brown people, a subsidized farm food distribution program for communities living under food apartheid, and domestic and international organizing toward equity in the food system. Leah's been farming since 1996, holds an MA in science education and a BA in environmental science and international development, and is a member of clergy in West African Indigenous Orisha tradition. Leah trained at Many Hands Organic Farm, Farm School Mass, and internationally with farmers in Ghana, Haiti, and Mexico, and also was a high school biology and environmental science teacher for 17 years. And Leah's books, Farming While Black, Soulfire's Practical Guide to Liberation on Land, and Black Earth Wisdom, Soulful Conversations with Black Environmentalists, are love songs for the land and her people. Thank you so much, Leah, for your devotion and welcome. And with that, I will pass it to you.
Thank you, Naima. Thank you, Jazz. Thank you, Athena. And greetings, everyone. It's such a blessing to be in the space with you. And we can go to the next slide because y'all know we don't start anything around here without acknowledging where we came from. None of us got here on our own. All of us stand on the shoulders of ancestors who have made immense sacrifices so we could enjoy the privilege of breathing, of tending to the land, of tending to one another. And I know for myself, I'm really feeling the presence right now of Naima and my grandmother in blessed memory, Brownie Lee McCullough, who is the one who taught us how to garden, strawberries in particular, and set us on a path of what Irsa Daily Ward calls pulling joy from the earth. And so with that, I would love if you all would think of an ancestor in your lineage, whether blood or spirit, who helped connect you to land, and drop their name in the chat. And we will include them in our beloved community today. We will welcome them to enjoy this time together and to lend their support and wisdom. So go ahead and honor those ancestors in the chat, and we can move to the next slide, which is our agenda. So here we are at Welcome and Intros. Athena and I will be passing the mic back and forth, and in this time we will be covering the context and background on these legal entities for land-based projects. There'll be a pair share breakout for you to digest some of the information. Then we'll go into several case studies that elucidate the structures that we're talking about. There'll be another breakout for an activity, and we'll have a Q&A at the end before we close. We do want to offer the disclaimer that we are not including any business planning, legal, or tax advice, and you probably will walk away with more questions than answers, but hopefully we'll help you know what questions you need to ask. And remember, as Naima said, tend to your needs as we go along. This is being recorded, so you don't have to stress if you need to take a breather for a moment. And given how much we want to share, we're going to encourage you to hold most of your substantive questions to the end. But if you have clarifying questions, drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to respond in real time to those questions. And with that, I will pass it to Athena to get us started.
Thanks so much, Leah. And thank you to everyone being here, choosing to be here in this moment. And it's such a pleasure and feel so urgent to be talking about this topic. And why are we here? Why are we even talking about legal entities? I trust and believe that people are here because they are in or desire to be in relationship to land in some way with clear intention and care for that land, and are figuring out how to do that under this dominant political economic system called capitalism. And so knowing that as we continue to do the crucial work of dismantling capitalism in real time We're still figuring out how to navigate some of the systems and pressures that we live in. And this is what we're hoping to give ourselves a way of thinking about that in this moment. So what is a legal entity? We view it as, or it's used as a tool predominantly by government systems to define how an entity is viewed within that legal system, within that culture and country's legal system. So disclaimer that not all countries, not all places will have the same orientation to defining a legal system, and feels important to note that legal entities are highly regulated through the United States state level um, organizational bodies, oftentimes the Department of State within a state. So please be aware that each state will have its own specificities around legal entities. But predominantly, we understand legal entities to be used to define who has ownership of a specific property, as the term we use within capitalism, and especially in ownership, how people are enforced or how the legal system enforces compliance within the terms of said legal system. But beyond the legal system itself, what do we do with a legal entity knowing that we're actively trying to work beyond or through capitalism to create something different? And I think for those of us who come to land work and land stewardship with with intention and value systems, we can look at a legal entity as a way for formalizing or legalizing our values and practices around land stewardship, being that individually or collectively. So it can be used as a way for implementing our ways of being in relationship to each other, if it's a group of people in land stewardship together, or as an individual who wants to really document and create enforceable measures for how we are stewarding said property in relationship to the legal systems that we're a part of. And so I want to emphasize that in the United States, which is an ongoing settler colonial project, the legal system is a system of power and domination. And so we have to consider, how are we using this tool wisely? And in such, I feel it's important to emphasize that there's a difference between a legal entity and the governance structure of any project. The legal entity defines how the government will view the project, how the government will enforce or monitor the project, and enact certain legal compliance measures. But that's different than the way that an individual or group will practice stewardship and practice and be in relationship to the land where they are envisioning or implementing this project. So I really want to emphasize that the legal entity itself is not a radical project. It's not where the work of transforming our systems is going to happen, but it can be a site for implementing strategic action, for harm reduction and repair, in the ways that we relate to each other and the way that we engage in stewardship collectively. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a bit more details on how we're defining ownership. I think most of us are aware of this, and I want to put in a little plug for folks to consider, how are you maybe practicing ownership in some of the areas of your life already that isn't necessarily defined by someone, by a legal system or a government saying that you own a certain property or item or piece of land. But what ownership from a legal perspective does is define who has the rights and privileges and responsibilities to an entity or so-called property, and specifically who has the right to make decisions about said property. And usually through the legal entity that you decide on, be it an operating agreement or whatever document is used to define the roles within the legal entity, it will outline which roles, which people have specific rights to which decisions. So maybe different people will have access to different decision-making rights or responsibilities. The legal entity, through an ownership defined through legal entity, will also name and identify an entity's tax status, which is really important to understand, how is the government going to treat said legal entity? What will they require you to do, be it from annual tax filings that may be necessary, certain types of reporting that you may be required to comply with. Again, I want to emphasize that this will be mostly dictated through the state level government and legal policies, and will require everyone to get familiar with their state's policies, either through your own research and, of course, with a legal professional when it gets to a certain level. And then finally, it's important to name that The legal entity's ownership will define who's liable for any time that the entity or the people related to the entity are found to be out of compliance with the policies that the legal system enforces. And so part of naming oneself or becoming an owner, either as an individual or group, comes with the risk and vulnerabilities of being the subject or object of liability and enforcement practices per the policies of the legal system. So something to consider in terms of risk and vulnerabilities is how are your personal assets being made at risk or vulnerable through the legal entity that you choose? Are individuals being held liable for things that the entity may be doing or not? That may differ depending on the legal entity that you choose. Certain entities may also have more access to certain types of funding based off of how foundations or the government will view said legal entity. For example, foundations will often prefer nonprofits due to the tax exemption that a nonprofit will offer. And then finally, legal entities offer some limited protections under the personal assets of an individual. So that might mean that if you establish a separate entity for the ownership of said property or the land project where you are, that might create separation between one's individual assets and the assets related to that entity. I do want to emphasize, however, that the legal system is only as effective of a tool as our dominant legal administration actually adheres to the language of the law. So under our current political conditions, political and economic conditions, we very much live under fascism. The legal system is used at the whim of our administration. And so that might mean that the legal administration might not have to comply with the law, but they will use that as a tool for control and domination and potentially punishment of those of us who live under the United States or whatever legal system that you find yourself under. Next slide, please. So finally, I wanted to give us a framework for how do we think about what are some of the principles that we can use to guide us in thinking through a legal entity and really the larger legal system that shapes the legal entities that we have access to. And I wanted to offer solidarity economy principles as one framework that can be really helpful for us to think these through. These solidarity economy principles were taken from a coalition of groups that came together to define how do we explicitly name the values of building a solidarity economy. And for those who may not be aware of the framework of a solidarity economy, it is an economy that is structured around the good of people and life and nature, as opposed to profit being the dominant principle of economy. And that's what many of us are working toward when we're thinking of a collective stewardship of land or even individual stewardship of land that's done with care and intention. So I won't necessarily go through all of these, but I want to offer these values around collective care, around accountability as really core for us to think through what is our relationship to the different levels of the project that we're working on. And you see the image on the right gives us some layers to consider as we're thinking through our project. Of course, we're talking about land projects here, but the land is never just the land, right? The land is all of life that exists on that land that is in relationship to that land, the creatures, the more than human entities that are part of it, more than human beings, not necessarily entities. And so you will want to, of course, consider the land as the core unit within the legal entity, but one should also consider what are the types of activities that are going to be happening on that land? How are those activities going to be resourced? How are the people who are in relationship to this land and the project going to be resourced and cared for? What is the type of infrastructure that's needed to make the project come to life and to sustain? Who is the community that this project and the people who are stewarding it are a part of? And what is the larger ecosystem that this project is a part of, including what are the political and economic conditions locally, regionally, statewide, and globally that should be taken into consideration for your project? And with that, I'll pass it to you, Leah.
Whew. Thank you for giving us that context and reminding us the bigger why. So just to pull some history into this for a moment about why it's so important what you all are doing around reclaiming our right to belong to the land. So y'all know that our ancestors have always, always, always been deeply rooted in belonging to land. And it's only because of 500 plus years of a project of racial capitalism and genocidal colonialism that disconnection has become a predominant experience for so many people in our community. And here's just a list of some of the ways that the government of this country and its predecessor colonial countries enacted violence on the relationship between Black and Brown people and the earth. Next slide. So what that's resulted in is that 98% of the farmland in this country is controlled by one racial group. And that racial group is white Americans, with 2% of that pie for all the indigenous folks, the Black folks, the Latina folks, the Asian folks, the multiracial folks, right? And so we have to remember that that's not our fault. It's not that we don't yearn for belonging to the land, but there's historical contexts that have resulted in the position where we're at, and you all are part of that reclamation. Next slide. And when we talk about belonging to the land, you know, there are both material and spiritual impacts to that. When we have land in our community, we have a place to grow food. We have a place to live. We have a place to bury our dead and know that we can come back every year to honor them and remember them. We have a place for the cookout and the family reunion, to be safe from ice where we can lock the door, right? And also, right? And also land is the major property is the major way that generational wealth is passed on. So, you know, as Ralph Page of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives says, you know, land is the basis of all wealth if we don't have anywhere out of the picture. And so there's been some really powerful studies done about the billions of dollars leached from the Black community because of land loss. Next slide. So when we start to talk about what are the legal structures that make sense for our land projects, we want to root as much as we can in Afro-Indigeneity, right? When our ancestors braided those seeds into their hair before being boarded on transatlantic slave ships to an unknown future, right? They believed in the seed and they believed in their connection to land and brought with them a number of technologies in terms of how we relate to land. Yes, farming technologies, of course, but also these structures for how we think about human belonging to the land. And I'll just name a couple of those for context. Next slide. So the first one, well, first to zoom out. So when you look at the legal structures that Europeans have imposed upon us, right? Concepts like individual ownership, private property, having a deed that proves that you own things, ownership being inherited, subject to taxation, and that owners have all the whole bundle of property rights. Like the owners can exclude others, they can sell the land, they can profit on the land, they can mine underneath the land, they can occupy and control, right? This is a European framework. When you look at indigenous frameworks, and granted this is reductionist because indigenous people are very diverse around the world, but some themes that you see is that there's some element of community control of the land, and that the use of the land is subject to community norms. So more often than having the idea of complete ownership, there's a community control, sometimes mediated by a council or a chief, and then a family will use the land and have the right to use the land for as long as they're using it, right? And some of those rights are retained by the community. For example, in some communities, you could not sell the land outside of the community. If you weren't using it, it would revert to the collective once again. And or maybe you are not permitted to mine the land because that would impact it for future generations. So there's a way that that I find when we're doing this work of trying to calibrate to these Western structures from an indigenous mindset, we have to do some internal decolonization about like me and mine and individuality. Next slide. So two of the systems I'll mention, one is the Husa system. This is of the Krobo people in Ghana. This is a multi-family lands ownership collective that does not have a legal structure, but is the predominant way that land is shared and controlled amongst the indigenous people of Krobo land in Ghana, West Africa. Next slide. And the second one that I'll mention is, really diminutized and even criticized in our society, which is something called heirs property, right? Heirs property you hear about as being a problem. And legally it is, because it's when an elder doesn't leave a will before they pass away and the property is inherited in common by the generations to come. And pretty soon you have so many owners that it's very difficult to maneuver legally. But this heirs property is really rooted in a Black collective principle called the kin-centric commons, or kin commons, where land is held by the family at large and not by any individual in the family. And so there's a cultural memory that results in some of these heirs property systems. Next slide. And here we are, right, trying to take these Afro-Indigenous concepts and like squeeze them into these legal structures. So let me talk to you about like 5 options at a high level that we'll explore further in the case studies. Next slide. So one of them is sole proprietorship. This is super simple. This is just when one person owns something. There's no distinguishing, no difference between your finances and that of your business. All you go down to the county clerk, you fill out a 1-pager to register the name of your business, and you report your income on your personal taxes. Doesn't offer any liability protection, but it does allow you to use a business name. So a lot of times when folks are getting started, they do a DBA or a sole proprietorship just to claim the name and then start to figure out the next thing. Next slide. Another option is an LLC, or a limited liability corporation. These are going in somewhat in the order of complexity. So an LLC is pretty simple and versatile. It is a corporation that you register with the state. You need to file your articles of organization with your Department of State, create an operating agreement, pay a filing fee, and put it in the newspaper that you created your LLC. And your personal assets are more protected with an LLC, meaning that there's a separation between the business and yourself. And usually, though, LLCs use something called pass-through taxation, where the individuals who are owners of the LLC, and there can be one or many, are just taxed on their individual taxes, though you can elect to have your LLC taxed as a corporation if you want the corporation to be taxed and not the individuals. And you can organize LLCs really almost any way that you want within the bounds of the law. So you could have an LLC that is governed as a cooperative. You can have an LLC that's governed as a monarchy. It really does, it's up to you in terms of your operating agreements, but what Athena was saying around the liberation being in how you work the internal system, regardless of what the structure is that you sort of report to the government, that's something to keep in mind. One thing to note about LLCs, which is we'll get to later, one of the reasons we chose one for one of our entities, is that children can be owners and undocumented people can be owners in an LLC. Next slide. Cooperatives. We love co-ops. Co-ops are so great. Black people helped invent co-ops. Yeah, shout out Fannie Lou Hamer, always, Freedom Farm Co-op. So co-ops are member-owned, member-controlled, and generate member benefit. They are democratic. Every member needs to have an equal vote. And all profits of a cooperative are distributed back to members proportionately to their investment or their ownership share, depending how it's structured. It's incorporated as a corporation and taxed as such, so the individuals are not taxed. But a co-op might have employees. So say the co-op is paying taxes to the government for any profits, but then employees are also getting paid, they're paying taxes on their wages as well, right? There's a board of directors, there's bylaws. You got to do your annual reports every single year to the government about what your co-op is up to. And there is a substantial amount of technical assistance for co-ops out there, including from the USDA. Next slide. 501c3s deserve like a whole week. They're very complex. 501c3s must be organized for a charitable, educational, or religious purpose. They were created to, quote unquote, relieve the burdens of government. And so it means that they need to perform a service for the community that the government is normally responsible for performing, with the exception of the religious purpose, which is exempted under the First Amendment. Farming is not a nonprofit purpose. And so a farm cannot be a nonprofit unless it is educational or charitable. Nonprofits can only engage in mission related activity, and there can be no private benefit. And this is, I want to pause here because this is an area that can get very tricky, because I can't tell you how many people I've consulted with that have started a nonprofit and then run into the legal challenge that they want to benefit themselves, understandably, with the nonprofit resources. For example, I would like to have this house and live in it that nonprofit money purchased. That's, I'll say, categorically illegal for most of the time, with some exceptions around like just compensation. And so if you're creating a business where you need yourself, your family, your friends to personally benefit, the nonprofit is either not the ideal structure, or it's good to have two structures. And we can talk more about that in the case studies. The great thing about nonprofits, you can get funding. You can get grant funding and donations. There are no owners. It's governed by a board of directors who must be disinterested from personally benefiting. And the attorney general has ultimate control over the nonprofit, subject to IRS rules. You can have employees, and you can also retain revenue each year. So a nonprofit might still be profitable in the sense that you make more money in a year than you spend, but no one pockets that revenue. There is intense scrutiny on nonprofits, and they are costly and time consuming to create and sustain. But the good news is that there's law schools that will help you with that. Next slide. And then the last one I'll mention, and we'll get into more of the case studies, is a land trust is just a subset of a nonprofit. It's a type of nonprofit. And specifically, it's dedicated to permanently conserving land, preserving affordable housing, and or protecting cultural heritage sites. And there are a special set of laws for land trusts that govern like the composition of the board of directors and its mission work. Next slide. We're going to skip that one. Just want to say that Black and brown people did a lot to create land trusts, so that's what this is. Next slide. So at this point, we are going to break out. Oh, actually, before I describe the breakout, I want to say that we're going to drop these slides in the chat because there's so much rich content, and we want to make sure you have a chance to absorb it at your own pace. So don't sweat. Feel free to check that out later. But we're going to break out in just a moment, and we'd love to give you a chance with a partner to digest this and talk about what is the purpose or vision of your land project. And if any of these specific legal entities have like piqued your interest so far or led to a question, you could discuss that as well. And we'll see you in a few minutes.
Hi, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. You'll be with one other person. Welcome back, everyone. I hope your conversations were meaningful in your breakout groups.
Welcome back, y'all. I think everyone is here getting themselves reacclimated. We're going to jump right back in because we got so much delicious information we want to share as much as we can with y'all. We can't, in the limited time we have together. If we can take it to the next slide, please. So we know that the time that you have in breakouts is never enough time, but we're hoping that at least got the juices going and giving you an opportunity to think of what your questions are and welcoming you to build up your roster of questions that hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to get to at the end of today's workshop. But we're going to start off where we left off, which was talking about land trusts. And we have a very broad description of the conventional structure of land trusts, again, as as Leah was mentioning around the basic structure being the CLT often the land trust often being a nonprofit organization that owns land in trust for a purpose, and beneficiary who is oftentimes stewarding the land on behalf of a group of people. That could be a geographic area, that could be a group of people who embody or share certain identities and experiences. There are a range of ways to organize land trusts. We're going to be focusing on community land trusts today, but I wanted to highlight that oftentimes the land trusts that we hear people talking about the most in relationship to land projects are conservation trusts and community land trusts. We won't do the overview in depth because we have so much information to cover, but I do want to do a deeper dive on community land trusts specifically and name that part of the mechanism that community land trusts use to protect land and to further specific purposes, usually community focused purposes and intended benefits of a land trust project, is to use the community land trust to separate ownership of land and then the housing that's on land. So community land trusts are often housing focused. And I'll be speaking from my experience of community land trusts, very specifically from an urban context and an urban housing context. But what you'll see often through community land trusts is that a ground lease, a 99-year ground lease, will be used to offer a community access to buildings or housing on the land that the community land trust owns, with the intention that even though land and the buildings on top of them are separated, the folks who are living and stewarding the land that's on top of that are owning and stewarding the buildings or the housing that are on the land that the community land trust owns, will use the 99-year ground lease to offer some stability and long-term strategizing and implementing stewardship structure over time through the community land trust structure. So the ground lease plays a really heavy role in the community land trust structure to offer that stability and also dictate the terms of the relationship between the community land trust and whatever body owns the building or housing that's on the land trust. So if we could take it to the next slide, please. This is, are folks able to see the image on the slide? For whatever reason, it's blank on my end, but I know my internet is a little bit iffy. No, okay, can't see the images for others. Okay, you know what? Oh, this just slow to load. It's coming. So as it's loading, I'll name that this is only one example of what a structure for community land trust can look like, and specifically one that is housing focused. It still doesn't seem to be loading on my end. No, it shouldn't be coming in parcels. Thank you, Amanda, for I see problem solving here in the chat. I think it's just the internet connection is slow. Oh, can we go back? There we go. Thank you. So this is just one very specific example of what a community land trust that's housing focused can look like. So you'll have on the bottom, the green rectangle will be the land trust itself, the community land trust, and the land that the community land trust owns. Oftentimes, the land trust body will be governed by what is called a tripartite board. So that means that there's a third of the board is represented by people who live on the land itself, people who are residents of the housing or land project that the community land trust encompasses. Another third of the board will be folks who have some sort of community relationship to where the land trust is operated. So either they work in the neighborhood, or they live in housing nearby, or they go to some religious institution in the area, have some sort of connection to the community land trust and where it's being operated.
And then the final third of the tripartite board will often be some person who has some sort of meaningful expertise or lived experience that can contribute to careful and intentional stewardship of the community land trust. So that could be someone who has experience in a land trust previously, or a housing co-op, or someone who has studied policy around community land trust and housing more broadly. And so here you'll see a community land trust that's paired with a housing cooperative, or different types of housing options. So a housing cooperative might look like a housing co-op that has some sort of limited equity involved. So there are restrictions on how the property can be sold or used. Oftentimes that will come with a tax credit to minimize some of the expenses that go to property taxes. Another type of institution or body that you'll see on top of a community land trust is a rental building. And in my experience in New York City, that's the most that is a frequent option, just because New York City is a renter's city. So you'll see the land trust will establish a relationship with another nonprofit who will own and manage the rental building. And oftentimes that second nonprofit that owns the building will also involve residents in the stewardship or management of the building that additional nonprofit owns. Another example of what you'll see on a community land trust are single family homes. Sometimes the homes are owned by the community land trust, or they can be owned by a separate entity that leases the homes to residents, and sometimes giving options for either limited sale options or other tax credits that may be available through the state or local municipalities. We can take to the next slide, please. So now is when we get into the case studies. How are we seeing some of these land entities or legal entities for land projects being implemented? Next slide, please. We can keep going. I'm going to be talking about the East Harlem and Barrio Community Land Trust. Again, this is a New York City focused or New York City based community land trust that I was a part of. And so I want to emphasize that this example very much comes within the context of an urban environment, New York City specifically, and New York City being a place that has very specific tenant policies and laws. So the purpose for the concept of I'm so sorry, someone I think so. They muted themselves. So the purpose statement for the East Harlem and Barrio Community Land Trust is it develops and stewards community-controlled, truly and permanently affordable housing, along with commercial, green, and cultural spaces in East Harlem and Barrio. We center the needs of extremely low to low-income households. And to ensure permanent affordability, the East Harlem and Barrio CLT owns land and leases it to buildings through long-term ground leases. We're also building a resident-led mutual housing association to give community members direct control over their homes and neighborhoods. We can take it to the next slide, please. So I want to give an overview of how the East Harlem Barrio CLT came to being, because I think it illustrates some of the processes and the resources and the challenges that go into establishing a land trust. So East Harlem Barrio takes its origins from an organization called Picture the Homeless, which is a member-led organization by and for folks who are houseless, who are really seeking options to create viable housing access for folks who are houseless. And specifically knowing that many folks are houseless because they don't have access to financial resources. And we were looking at low cost housing options, and very specifically in New York's context, rental housing options. So one of the ways that Picture the Homeless, or PTH for short, made this all possible was by doing a study on the commodification of housing in New York. And they spent over a decade organizing, talking to folks in East Harlem and throughout the city of what their experience was in New York City housing. And as you might imagine, countless stories of folks who had their rents raised on them out the blue, who were paying an exorbitant amount of their income, an exorbitant percentage of their income just on rental housing or any form of housing to keep a roof over their heads. And oftentimes in unkept housing that was kept in really poor condition. And so Picture the Homeless, through their organizing and research, published a study called Banking on Vacancy that called out the speculation on real estate in New York City, which often is replicated or found in similar conditions anywhere on earth, not just in the United States, but real estate and housing specifically used as a profit-making tool for folks who own oftentimes an immense amount of properties, and who use their large real estate portfolio to control rental or housing prices that inevitably were completely inaccessible to the vast majority of residents in the city. And so through calling out this flagrant disregard for the well-being of people in the city, calling on politicians to offer real options for folks, especially houseless folks, but any low-income or middle-income person to have just access to housing, they created this study and pushed for the establishment of community land trust as a recognized entity within New York City. In New York State, in 2020, in 2018, started to issue funds that were specifically dedicated for organizing around community land trusts. This supported Picture the Homeless to establish a separate entity, which became the East Harlem and Barrio Community Land Trust, with collaborators that allowed them to explore, to focus on East Harlem and Barrio, a neighborhood in Upper Manhattan, to see what's possible for a community land trust that gave low income housing and made that viable. So in 2020, the East Harlem Barrio Community Land Trust was able to acquire its first 4 sets of properties. These were properties that had been owned by the city initially, and were transferred into ownership of the community, or rather the land that these buildings are on was transferred into the ownership of the East Harlem Barrio Community Land Trust, while a mutual housing association was created as a separate entity that owns the land that's on the community land trust. And it's important to note that the mutual housing association was able to negotiate, or rather the CLT in collaboration with our partners was able to negotiate that all the apartments in the mutual housing association would be kept below market rate. I also want to emphasize again that part of what made this possible was the deep organizing history in New York City. Everything from squatters in the 80s calling out insurance agencies or owners of buildings burning their buildings down to take advantage of insurance payouts. Everything from folks squatting in buildings to claim that they needed shelter over their head, whether they were renters or not. Folks organizing around preventing evictions just because people couldn't pay rent. All of that influenced the conditions that made the community land trust movement in New York City able to grow and take off. Next slide, please. So this is a depiction of the ownership and governance structure of the CLT. And it's important to note that the buildings that are part of the East Harlem El Barrio CLT are we're in such poor condition, that a massive amount of rehabilitation was required on those buildings. So the CLT owns the land. So we split up the structure of ownership and governance to what happens during the rehab and what happens after the rehab of those buildings. During the rehab, the Community Land Trust owns the buildings owns the land and the buildings, while the Mutual Housing Association trained residents to be able to be skilled enough to step into management capacity and leadership roles of the mutual housing once the rehabilitation was completed. And you'll see with our developer partner, Banana Kelly and Catch. Banana Kelly and Catch in the East Harlem Barrio Mutual House Community Land Trust. I'm so sorry, y'all, getting my acronyms mixed up. Our developer partners and the East Harlem Barrio Community Land Trust had a different number of seats on the board of the Mutual Housing Association as the overall structure was being set up in the rehab. Now, post-rehab, you'll see that we have um, a shift towards tenant ownership and tenant stewardship of the Mutual Housing Association. And what was planned there at the time that I left the East Harlem Barrio CLT, rehabilitation had not been completed. But what was planned is that once rehab was done, Each building would elect a tenant representative that would then step onto the Mutual Housing Association board to engage in management and stewardship of the Mutual Housing Association that owned the buildings that they lived in. And then the Community Land Trust, the entity that owns the land, will also bring on tenants from those buildings to be part of the stewardship of the land itself and the entity that owns the land where the buildings are on. The separate ownership, I see your question. That feels like a more of a content question, so I'm going to leave this toward the end, Val, but I appreciate your question around the separate ownership of land and buildings. And next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight some challenges around the establishment of the East Harlem Barrio Community Land Trust. One, again, I named that the buildings that the land trust acquired and the land that was on them were formerly city-owned buildings, buildings that have been in the city's ownership since the 80s. And for the most part, the city acquired through the foreclosure crisis in the 80s when many communities, and often Black and Brown communities, couldn't get loans to be able to maintain ownership of their properties used through redlining, which we won't go into, but that's an important part of ownership and housing history in the United States. And so when the Community Land Trust and the Mutual Housing Association acquired the buildings, they were in terrible condition. That means that the cost of rehabilitating those buildings also was passed on to the Community Land Trust and the Mutual Housing Association, and by extension, the people living in those buildings. And so while all of the rents of the Community Land Trust were maintained below market rent, the current residents did see a significant increase in their rents, some of whom were at the time before the transfer to the Community Land Trust, were paying between $200 or $300 in rent in their city-owned rental apartment. And so we have to consider what are the options, the real viable options for land acquisition in any place, but especially in a city context where property land ownership is such a commodity, and the prices of acquiring land make it so inaccessible for the average people. And so emphasizing here that land acquisition oftentimes is not just a question of money, but organizing, identifying and understanding the systems that prevent access to land in the first place, and knowing who our targets are to shift policies around who has access to land and what city or municipal or government resources are being allocated to make it possible for communities to acquire the land or the buildings in their own neighborhoods. And so this I think highlights a very common theme globally under capitalism, which is there's a difficult balance to maintain between the affordability of housing, be it rental or family-owned housing, and the financial health of a property. So in the case of the East Harlem Barrio CLT and Mutual Housing Association, rent had to be raised to be able to meet the loans involved for rehabbing the buildings. And no community should be held responsible for the neglect of their own buildings, neglect that was imposed by city governance. Or in other cases, municipal governance or private ownership. So I want to emphasize that in our effort to acquire land for the sake of protecting it, for the sake of caring for it, often requires us to engage in organizing for the sake of shifting power and shifting access to some of our most basic necessities. And then the final thing that I'll emphasize is that oftentimes folks are really excited about the idea of collectively owning property, either because they have historically over generations been so disenfranchised, so disconnected from the concept of ownership just because of the legacy of capitalism within the ongoing settler colonial project that is the United States and in other places as well. But also because in our busy lives, oftentimes people don't necessarily have the skill or even the desire and energy to engage in collective stewardship, which takes a lot of work. And so sometimes what we'll see in efforts to build a collective stewardship project is not only are we required to understand the local conditions and policies and laws that shape our opportunities for engaging in collective stewardship, but we'll also have to build muscle and skill around being in decision making together, being in navigating conflict together, being able to work through difficult topics and identify who are the real targets who create pressures that force us to take our housing conditions or our land conditions in our own hands. And while we can often ask for support for some of the technical aspects of land stewardship, such as hiring a lawyer to figure out the legalities, there really is no fast track for understanding how to be in decision making and navigating conflict together. And want to emphasize the governance element that is separate from the legal entity really requires a lot of work and attention. I'll pass it to you, Leah, for our next case study.
Thank you. I'm so grateful that you uplifted that of what is the work we need to do about being in governance and navigating conflict together, because I think that's one of the biggest pieces we underestimate when we're doing these collective projects. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to look at 3 different legal entities that I had the privilege of being part of founding, and some of the characteristics of each. So we'll look at a nonprofit, we will look at a land trust, and we will look at a co-op that's structured as an LLC. So first, let's look at the nonprofit. So here we are, Soulfire Farm Institute, Inc. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We incorporated as a nonprofit after 5 years of being a sole proprietorship, just a family farm, and built a nonprofit board, started doing fundraising, brought on employees. And one of the reasons that we decided to create the nonprofit is we realized that there was a lot of demand for educational programming, and education being a nonprofit compatible mission needed to be able to garner the resources and also have the accountability to the community for that educational work that we're doing. So our purpose statement, we got some good feedback that a mission sort of drives the idea of like missionaries. So we say purpose statement is really around uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system through farming, distributing food, and training farmers. Next slide. And a nonprofit, and this is true of any organization, but nonprofits especially, it's super important to be mission and values driven. And so I love this graphic, and shout out to our wonderful teammates, Krista among them, for making this visually beautiful. But our entire team of staff and board spent a couple of years refining our mission and values to clarify our big why. So we are here and organized around land stewardship, Black agrarianism, interdependence, intersectionality, accountability, and excellence for our community. Next slide. And here's our staff. There's 18 of us, y'all. We went from this tiny family farm to this whole organization. And there's been so much to learn about along the way. Like if you would have asked me 10 years ago in 2015 when we incorporated the nonprofit about audits, IRS audits, workers' comp audits, exempt versus non-exempt workers, private benefit in your leases, I would say I have no idea what you're talking about. And so I mentioned this because in a nonprofit structure, as I alluded to earlier, the compliance meter is turned up. And so there are a lot of pieces to navigate that might be different from a more informal structure or even an LLC. And when you are small and under the radar, some of those can be overlooked. But if you are a nonprofit that is in the public eye, those items cannot be overlooked, and they can define culture. They can define organizational culture, those compliance pieces. So just want to mention that as a challenge, but of course the blessing of nonprofit structure, as long as you remember that the revolution will not be funded and it can't be the only structure, is that it is a way to garner resources to be able to do the work, to be able to pay folks living wages, to be able to invest in infrastructure. And so that's often why people choose the 501c3 route. That tax exemption is what makes possible a lot of the resourcing. Next slide. And, there's just a timeline of our growth from baby family farm up to like a full-fledged, organization with employees and departments and all of that, with some milestones and some growing pains along the way. And so and Naima, thank you for creating this beautiful graphic on the occasion of our 10-year anniversary as the nonprofit organization, or as the farm. And I mention this too because a lot of times when we see, a land trust like Athena was talking about, or we see Soulfire, we think, oh my goodness, I have to get all of this together in the next year or 2 years or 3 years. And we need to remind ourselves, give ourselves grace and remind ourselves how long it takes to build an institution that has the institutional memory, the internal structures and procedures, the cultural norms, division of responsibilities, protocols for how we address conflict. Those things don't happen overnight. They're built over time. And having a realistic sense of, if you know that you're aiming for a big vision, it might take a decade, right, or more to actualize that vision to the extent that you dream of, and that's okay. And remembering to inhabit that peacefully and to enjoy the process, because if we convince ourselves, which is capitalism again, that we'll be happy when, in some future time when all of this is worked out, we're going to miss life. And so, slowing down and enjoying the steps along the way. Next slide. And here's just a snapshot to give an example of the types of programs that we do at Soulfire and the impact. So, we're feeding the community through solidarity shares. We're doing farmer training, uprooting racism training, youth work, building urban gardens, public speaking, running online classes, technical assistance, and on and on. And I share this in part because one of the obligations of a nonprofit is to have transparency with the public and with the government about what you accomplish in every year that ties to that educational mission. So it's not a secretive or private type of entity to create. Next slide. And similarly, your finances are public for everyone to see as well and scrutinized. Like if you are over the audit thresholds, even the minutes of your board meetings must be submitted. And you can see here from Soulfire Farms breakdown that we are predominantly funded by grants and donations, with earned income from program fees and selling merchandise and farm, making up less than a quarter of our revenue. Next slide. So that was nonprofits. The next thing I want to talk about is land trust. So the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, next slide, was born out of potlucks in the winter of 2017 at Soulfire Farm, where Black and Brown farmers in our region were expressing just how cold and lonely we get up here. And right now I'm looking out at snow and remembering that time and how good it felt to just be in space together, to share our common gripes and common joys. And then folks said, we really need a network. We really need a network of farmers of color in the Northeast. And so first started with a network and polled the network to see what were the biggest needs. And it quickly emerged that almost all of the Black and Brown farmers in the Northeast were farm workers or tenant farmers and did not have land. And so there was a clamoring to figure out how to get land in the hands of Indigenous, Black, and communities of color. So we had this was our big first gathering at Smith College in 2018 to start to brainstorm and to see where the trust and the lack of trust was in our community, and to begin to heal and build together. Next slide. So NEFOC was really looking at the time at the fact that in the United States, if you can believe that, with 98% of the land being white owned in the United States is even worse than the Northeast. It's only a fraction of a percent in the Northeast, and that there are so many reasons that our ancestors were pushed off the land and needed to be able to come home. Next slide. And so, oh yeah, we have a picture from those early meetings. That was really sweet. And so in its early days, and it's important to mention this because there's so many ways to start out. The Northeast Farmers of Color Network and Land Trust were incubated within Soulfire Farm. And so what that means is for 2 years, Soulfire Farm Institute, Inc., the nonprofit, provided the funding, and the staff people who were hired to get NEFOC off the ground were employees of Soulfire Farm. And so that's a form of very involved fiscal sponsorship. Sometimes fiscal sponsorship looks like just more like pass through. There's a 501c3 that wants to support your nascent baby project. And so they're willing to just, pass money through that you get in grants. But then there's also a more hands-on way of doing fiscal sponsorship, which is really to take this new idea almost as a program underneath the C3 until it's ready to launch. Similarly, the Breeding Seeds Fellowship, if folks have heard of that, is incubated under Soulfire Farm and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. It doesn't have its own 501c3, even though it has semi-autonomous governance. So all that to say, there was a couple of years of incubation before fledging, and lots of meetings and discussions and planning. Next slide. And there's a few tools that felt really important for NEFOC to be able to use as it looked ahead to acquiring land or supporting folks in acquiring land. And one of the important values of NEFOC was deference to the indigenous people who are the rightful stewards of their own homelands. And so making sure that at the speed of trust, those relationships are built, that there's opportunities for land back for indigenous communities. And then when land is going to non-indigenous people, including Black people, that there's a tool called a cultural respect easement that's enacted. We have one here at Soulfire Farm, and it's legally it's similar to a utilities easement. So like a utility company often has the right to put like wires through your land, or, you know, transformer on your land if you're between something and something else. And so this is the legal basis for it, but essentially it gives a positive use right rather than a restriction right, where most conservation easements have like a restriction. So ours says that the Mohican Nation and its citizens can use certain parts of the land in perpetuity here. And in a similar way, you know, the encouragement is for folks involved in these NEFOC land projects to do the same. And shout out to Ramona Peters of the Native Land Conservancy of Mashpee Wampanoag for developing this tool. Next slide. So a couple land trusts that we looked at as we were building out NEFOC. I just mentioned the Native Land Conservancy, also the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, the Berkshire Community Land Trust, and Agrarian Trust. Next slide. And Athena talked about this, so I'm not going to get into it too much as far as the governance of community land trusts, but I think NEFOC's moved away from this, but I'll just mention briefly that a structure that can work with a regional land trust is when the land trust is incorporated as a C3, 501c3, but each of the individual land projects are their own 501c2, which is a form of subsidiary of the C3, where you still have a lot of the tax advantages, but you can have a semi-autonomous governance structure. So say, for example, the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust at a future date were to support 10 land projects across the Northeast. NEFOC could be a 501c3, and each of these land projects could be their own 501c2, inheriting some of the benefits and protections of the parent organization, but maintaining a governance board that reflects the local conditions. And Agrarian Trust has really done a lot of work at elucidating this, this model. Next slide. So one of the exciting things that I've gotten to do as a NEFOC member, because I learned so much about land trusts and being part of that original circle, is to support other folks in starting land trusts in other places. And so in Puerto Rico and Borinquen, there are some incredible groups of folks, farmers and land stewards and housing justice advocates who've been using land trusts as a tool for land sovereignty. And this is one of the workshops that I helped to co-facilitate with Ana Elisa Perez of La Colmena Cimarrona. And we did workshops in San Juan, and we also did workshops in Vieques for community members. Next slide. All right, so that's, oh yeah, I was like, there's one more picture. Sorry, go back one. Because I just have to show you, Ana Lisa is like my sister from another mother. Like we are, the La Colmena in Vieques is very similar to Soulfire Farm and the types of work that it does. And so years before we'd even met each other, people were saying, oh, you have to collaborate. So we found our synergy in collaborating on supporting folks in creating their own land trusts and being able to resist gentrification of their island. Next slide. And then the last case study I'll mention that I'll take a little bit more time on is our co-op. Next slide. So a lot of folks don't know that Soulfire Farm Institute, Inc., which is our 501c3, does not actually own the land here. The land, again, owned, I'll use the colonial term, but we all know that, you know, you can't own Mother Earth. The land here is owned through a cooperative. That cooperative is Soulfire Farm Land Stewardship Collective LLC. It was incorporated as an LLC, but is governed as a co-op and taxed as a co-op at the federal level. And our, so I'll call it the Land Co-op for short because it has a very long name. The goal of creating the Land Co-op was to increase BIPOC property ownership right here in Grafton, New York, by supporting secure land tenure, technical assistance, safety in numbers, and mutual aid and community building. Next slide. So it was very important to us when when my spouse and I and our wonderful two children who were babies at the time and now are all grown, when we first came out and fell in love with this land in 2006, we bought it the way that so many USers buy stuff. We just paid money and signed, a paper, and then it was like ours as a family. But the intention was never to privately own it. We always had interest in figuring out how to do collective ownership and also how to honor lands back. And it took a lot of years actually of like legal research to find the right entity and the right way forward, because as you know, our legal system is not structured in a way that understands collectivism or native rights or the rights of nature. So in getting to know the Mohican people, that was one of the first things we asked them. We said, we want to create this collective entity. Like, do you want to be involved? Do you want to own part of it? Or do you want to own it? We'll be your tenants. So anyway, next slide. Long story short, what we ended up working on with them was first the cultural respect easement, which I already explained, as well as a number of smaller projects. We have a seed rematriation project. We did some anti-pipeline organizing. But most recently, we're able to do a very deep collaboration with the Mohican Tribal Council where we fundraise to purchase a spiritually significant piece of land in our neighborhood, a 250-acre piece of land. And there are many partners in this, the Peace Pagoda and others, and then to give it back to the Mohican Nation. So we just completed this incredible project, and we did a sacred pilgrimage to honor it and ceremonies, and the youth came out, and it was a very beautiful collaboration. Next slide. So a little bit about the structure of the co-op. It was really important to us that the people who live here, including the people who live here because they are in employee housing for the nonprofit, have rights and control over the land upon which they live. And we realized pretty quickly with the C3 fundamentally being controlled by the government that we didn't have the degree of autonomy and control and privacy that we needed for where we were living. And it didn't make sense for the C3 to own the land. So that's why the co-op owns the land. We also wanted to permanently protect this beautiful site. To honor the rights of nature, which we do through an annual divination where nature has veto power over what we decide. And to have the capacity for families and households to have secure land tenure, but for the nonprofit to also be able to attain its educational goals. And at another time, I can explain there was more complexity in that than we realized, but we're moving through. Next slide. All right, almost there. I'll skip that. Next slide. So when you're creating a co-op, you do have to still follow certain cooperative guidelines. And if it is a housing co-op, there are additional, at least in New York State, there are additional guidelines around property taxes, capital gains, and disclosure for people who are joining the co-op. Next slide. Next slide. I'm skipping a few just for time. So something that's important about the decision-making structure in a co-op, I mentioned one member, one vote. And the vote is not tied to any percentage ownership or other factors. Decisions are made by consensus with a supermajority fallback. And members of our co-op, we own the land collectively, but folks can build equity in their individual homes that they buy or that they build themselves. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So I want to pause a little bit here on rights of the land because this sounds really great in theory, but we are so indoctrinated with human supremacy that it's very difficult for us by and large, to not do the thing we want to do because the earth wants something else. And so, for example, here on this land, we do divination every year, and the land has said no to some things like, no, you can't dig that pond, or no, you can't cut that tree or build that building. And in order to, like, what is it to actually have the patience and the humility to wait until the moment is right for those things is important. Next slide. So here's a site map that just shows of the 80-acre property, sort of how we've allocated the different uses. There's a very large commons. It's mostly wildlife habitat and trails. There's an area that's designated for the nonprofit to use, which is the majority of what you all see when you come visit. And then there's tiny little area for some like residential sites for future building. Next slide.
Oh, shoot. Oh, she said forward.
The last thing that I'll say about the co-op is that currently what we're up to is a lot of mutual aid among the members. We have like a chat group and people need a ride or grocery shopping. We try to support one another. We also have a revolving mortgage and construction loan fund. I've written a couple of books and I've donated the royalties of those books to this revolving mortgage fund. So it reduces the financial barrier to folks building or buying a home. I mentioned the Mohican land back work. And something that I'm really excited about is like, there's a lot of folks who want to move out to Grafton, but maybe for various reasons, it's not a fit to build a house from scratch in the woods. We do have a down payment assistance that incentivizes people to come be our neighbors and be in, walking or biking distance from us. Next slide. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Athena to explain our next breakout.
Thanks so much, Leah. I really enjoyed learning from you about these projects, and I'm sure there's so much more to learn and share. And knowing that the work is never finished and there's always more to learn, we're going to shift into a small group activity just to give you all an opportunity to think through some of these options practically. We know we have folks probably at a range of touch points with their projects. Maybe it's just a feeling in your heart. Maybe it's an idea. Maybe it's a project that's already coming to life. But we want to give y'all a couple of options here. So we're going to break y'all up into breakout rooms. We're going to give you about 10 minutes. And you have the options in groups of 3 to either choose 1 or 2 of these questions to discuss, or you'll find a link in the chat that will take you to an extensive flow chart that will ask you questions about your land project and encourage you to consider certain options within conditions that you, per the answers you give. So I would encourage y'all to choose which of these options feels right for your little configuration in the breakouts, and you'll have 10 minutes there. And want to note that this flowchart is extracted from a much more extensive guide created by Farm Commons called The Farmer's Guide to Farm Businesses. We'll send out the link to the full guide after the workshop, but you can see the questions will be broadcast. Thank you for asking that, Ashani. And then for those who you also find the link to the flow chart in the slides themselves if y'all are in there. So please flag us if you have any questions or technical difficulties, but you should be all set to go into your breakout groups, which I'm sure are being set up in this moment.
Yeah, here
Yes.
we go. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that your conversations were fruitful and meaningful. We recognize it wasn't not enough time to answer all the questions, but I hope you continue reflecting individually and in your various formations and with friends. And if there's anything that you want to share in the chat that was particularly juicy or insightful from your conversations, please feel free to do that. And we're going to use the remainder of our time together to have an opportunity for questions and answers. And you are welcome to come off mute to ask your question, or if you prefer to put it in the chat, I can read it out loud. So yeah, anything you wanted to get a little more details on, or questions that are arising from your conversations, feel free to share now.
Uh, I have a question. I don't know if that's okay if I'm just saying it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. There's been a lot of information, so I can't even ask all the questions I want to. But the first two questions that I have, this is a little offshoot of the reason why I'm even on this, but I am fascinated by any insights that you've had about folks that do purchase land in the orbit of a land project. I'm fascinated by that because I think that when you have that type of ecosystem, you're just building up economies and building up communities together. And I find that really powerful. And I wanted to know if there's insights on that. And in our breakout group, we were talking about just the different terms and concepts of what it means to have land back. Um, and what are some supportive structures for us to continue having those conversations, and if there are opportunities for us to continue having these conversations about it, so that we do not feel overwhelmed, or so that we do not feel like there's this sense of oh, that it's too much, or that we don't belong in this space as a family who is trying to get back land that was taken from us. By a man who swindled. Oh yeah, my mom is. She's like, by a man who swindled our great great grandfather. Anyway. By a man whose grandfather swindled my great grandfather. Yeah. Out of his oyster farm. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, I'm so terribly sorry to hear that you and your family and that you've had that experience. And I really appreciate y'all um, exploring what it means to get that land back and asking some of the questions that you are. I'm so sorry. I think, Grace, you asked the question, and I'm not sure I fully understood the first part of your question, but I did get the second part. Leah, I don't know if I'm happy to get us started here, but also if you feel, okay. Um, so Grace, I don't know if you're up for putting in the chat, or maybe I'll give you a moment to rephrase the first part of your question, but I did want to speak to what you mentioned around land back, and wanted to first say that I understand land back to mean something really specific, which was created by Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, but not exclusively so. Turtle Island being not the overall term that all Indigenous peoples use for what is called the United States, but often used to refer to this landmass, to refer to land being returned specifically to people who are Indigenous to this area, which may be different than land being returned to folks who are not Indigenous, but who still had land and property taken away from them. And so I don't know what your experience may be in that mix, but it feels important to name land back as a really specific movement with specific context. In terms of getting the land that was taken from you, I would, I mean, there are so many questions that I would have to be able to understand the specifics of that. But some broad strokes that might be helpful are, of course, understanding what are the legal context within your local area that might shape whether what was done is legal in your context. And then outside of legality, how I understand uh, having access to land, be it taking back land in some capacity or land that community wants to be in stewardship of, is it usually comes down to people power, people naming that they are in relationship to this land and organizing each other to both call attention to the intention and purpose of it, and oftentimes putting pressure on those who do have some sort of meaning control. So that could be any major real estate bodies, oftentimes private, that have ownership of the property in question, or who are the political actors involved in your particular context, your local politicians, your local governing bodies that have to do with housing
either if there's public regulation of that housing in some capacity. I really want to emphasize organizing as one of the main tools that I have seen used to be in relationship to land. And there are differences of opinion about what is the function of legal processes. And I think we've seen that legality oftentimes has little to do with it, right? Our legal systems are used against us more often than not. And so what we have to do is how do we confront the legal tools used against us? And people power is usually the answer. But would love to hear from you, Leah, if you have anything you want to add there, or even any contradictions.
I think that was beautiful. And I think for time, we could go to the next question.
I'd love to read out loud a question that came in the chat. Um, there's interest in learning more about the process of the land itself having veto power.
I can start by speaking to that. So for context, when we approached the student lawyers at the Pace Legal Clinic and said, this new landholding entity, we would like nature to be a person, nature to have rights, similar to how the Menominee have granted their wild rice personhood status in their own tribal legal system, or how Maori people have given rivers legal status. And there is no legal precedent for this in US law. So it was not possible to do it the same way that Indigenous people have done it. So we gave our lawyers it was hard for them to really think about how do we mold the Western legal structure to allow nature, who's not a person, in the Western legal structure to be a person. And so what we were able to do is to build into our operating agreements these checks and balances where just as it outlines in our operating agreements, like the voting structure and how powers rest amongst the people, it specifies that every year the annual plan that we have is submitted for divination. And so in our case, we use Yoruba Ifa divination system. So, a trained priest who's initiated and authorized, who's not one of us, who's a decision maker, will do a divination, and based on the outcome of that, will sort of say yes or no to the plan and how we might need to modify the plan. I will say that the New York State Attorney General caught wind of this and almost we had to go through a process to prove that we were not a religious organization or mandating any particular religion for people to participate, for that to be allowed, like in our operating agreements, but it is now allowed. So that's something we do each year.
Thank you so much, Leah. We have a stack of questions in the chat, and I know some people may also want to come off mute to say something. So I'll pause and see if somebody wants to say a question, and then I'll bring the next question that's from the chat. Okay. There was some resonance around this question of guidance around how to balance the reality of slow, sustainable institutional development with what feels like the urgent need for solutions now. And there's a quote from Bio Kumalafe saying, "These times are urgent, let us slow down," and what this might look like in the practice of land stewardship and building land-based solidarity economies.
Shall I get us started, Leah? I lean on this quote often, so thank you for lifting it up. It feels so necessary to hold it in these times, and it comes up inevitably almost in every space that I have been in relationship to around organizing of any kind, but especially related to land, knowing that not only are we living in fascism, but relatedly, we're living in a climate crisis and climate collapse. And we have questions around, how can we respond to the urgency of the world as we know it collapsing? One thing I want to offer is that many indigenous wisdoms and communities have as part of their history is the world ending over and over again. The world has ended so many times over for so many peoples and cultures. And I think what I've learned along the way is that there really is no fast track for coming to alignment on what is the intention and purpose of the project, and what are the principles and values that will guide us bringing a project to life, or an intended land stewardship effort to life. And so certainly there are times in which, you got to act, but I don't think there's a shortcut for people coming together to determine the rules of engagement is one way of calling it, but really guidelines for what are our non-negotiables for how we're in relationship to each other and how we're in relationship to the land. Because the alternate is, if you skip that process and find yourself moving forward with a project without that clarity, oftentimes we can reproduce the harms that we're seeking to repair or undo. Um, so emphasizing the terms of call it community agreements, call it operating agreements, call it a vision and purpose for your project. I think taking the time to be in that is necessary, alongside identifying what are the urgencies, what are the conditions that are time sensitive, and can we split up our people power? Somebody works on the slow work of relationship building, or rather defining the terms as we all work on it together, while maybe another group is working on the urgent elements. Would love to pass it to you, Leah, if there's anything you would add there.
Well, that was beautiful. The only thing I would say is that we don't have to wait to have a legal entity figured out to start the work. And there are ways to put down, we didn't talk about this, but a contract, right? So if there's a group of people working together on something and you want to define the terms of engagement, you can write them down and everyone can sign that paper, and that's a contract, and then you can do the work and let the figuring out of the legal structure emerge over time, slow and fast.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We only have time for one more question, and there's so many good questions. Um, so what I'll offer is that the ones that are a little more straightforward, we can answer in a follow-up email, like sharing more resources and ideas about um, like law clinics from universities and that kind of a thing. And we'll have one more that's a bit more conversational. I'm going to kind of blend these questions and pass it to you, Leah, to distill what you will, okay? um, so there's interest in like the structures that allow folks to realize equity, as well as what happens when there are challenges with zoning, when you have multiple components like agricultural and commercial, or for example, like a mental health retreat and a sanctuary. And if you even want to weave in a little bit about how to navigate power shifting in the journey of buying land to then opening it up to wider community. So I know that's a lot, but if you want to, yeah, just point to
It
what
was zoning, power shifting. What was the first one?
and equity, how to realize equity.
That can mean a lot of things. All right, let me do the second two.
Okay.
Clear. Equity in terms of,
It says, what is the difference in the structures that allow people to realize equity?
okay. If someone wants to drop in the chat a little bit more about how you're defining equity in that context, like in terms of power within, power between, holding responsibilities, racial justice, that would just be helpful. But as far as yeah, I would say with zoning, it's something to pay attention to when you're looking for land, if that's an option for you, because a lot of times certain towns, they will have restrictions on how many structures you can do per parcel, or a certain number of acres required in order to put a house. Like for example, in Grafton, it's only one house every 5 acres, and you have to get a variance to cluster your buildings together, even though we generally have pretty lenient zoning. So the last thing you want to do is like invest your whole heart and resources into a place where you couldn't actualize your vision. But I will say that the local real estate agents, the ones that have been around for a long time, oftentimes have ideas about how to push the edges of what's possible in your town, and so make friends with them. For us, it's Dean here Realty. And then the question was about, sorry, what was the third topic?
How have you navigated power shifting in the journey of buying land and then opening it up to wider community?
It's a really good question, and there's different opinions on this. I will say that I have found in my own experience as someone who has helped to get a number of projects off the ground that starting with a smaller number of decision makers and clarifying what you're doing and why and solidifying that is beneficial before you add more decision makers, even if those fewer decision makers are still accountable to, say, like focus groups or community data gathering to shape the vision. I've seen some projects really struggle when they create too big of a circle initially, struggle with the momentum to coalesce in the specificity of what they're trying to do. So that's an opinion, not like an objective truth, but I'll just share that from my own experience. And passing it to you, Athena, to comment.
I was a bit distracted from responding in the chat as well. I'm so sorry.
Responding in the chat. And actually, if it's okay, I would like to bring us to our closing. Though feel free if there's some final words, Athena, but I just want to make sure that we end on time. So I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. We can move towards closing. Thank you. I know we're about to end here.
Thank you for the juicy questions and the really thoughtful answers. And we will be sure to share more resources in the follow-up email, including this recording and the slides, so that you can go back and make sure you caught everything. So grateful to you, Leah, and to you, Athena, for the powerful and insightful content that you share with us. And thank you again, Jazz, for holding down tech. For our closing, I wanted to offer a poem from my heart to yours. So if you're not in a rush to go off, it's about a 3-minute poem. And if you need to move on to your next thing, I will understand and no hard feelings. But just want to offer this poem as spell casting for the world building work that we are doing, with deep gratitude to each of you for all that you are shaping and founding and building and devoted to in your lives and communities. Can you picture it? We all have shelter, with light pouring in, big pots of broth from the stems and skins of last week's cooking steaming on the stove. 3 and more generations in one home, taking care of each other, rubbing each other's heads and feet before bed. No one is alone, not even our ancestors, who are crowding around our kitchen tables with stories of when the trees could talk and people could fly, reminding us how to harvest medicine, travel through time, read the sky. Can you picture it? We all take only what we need, share and cherish what we have, saving seeds, swapping clothes, trading food, reusing bottles and bags and good advice. We collect water on rooftops and plant flowers that bring back bees and heal sickness. Can you picture it? We move through conflict with big mugs of honey lemon balm tea and the ones who love us by our sides, supporting us to listen deeper, soften our hearts, make amends, remember our promises and the truth of who we are. Can you picture us weaving into kinship? No one a stranger, no one ostracized, no one reduced to their usefulness. We all are enough, and we all have enough, and we realize enough is enough, and we're satisfied. We work hard and play harder, proud of the generous commitment of our hands to the workings of the world we cherish, and then we rest. And the earth rests too, with our less doing, less consuming, less commuting. The smog fades and the salmon and sparrows return. And of course, there's universal health care, but we hardly need it because the air is so clean and the water pristine and the food so dang good, glistening with the minerals of the rich Black soils and the thick true love with which it was made. And our hearts beat strong from ample affection and long walks through the meadow at sunset. Our lungs pump good from so much singing and dancing, our tail feathers iridescent, our throats open, and we are singing. Hallelujah. Can't hide love. I'm living my life like it's golden, golden, because stolen lands are returned to tribes. And detention centers are retrofitted as freedom schools, and fossil fuel fortunes fund electricity and transportation for people everywhere, powered by the sun. And all that gunmetal is recalled and transformed into roller coaster rides that make you feel like you about to die. But ain't nobody dying. No one getting killed by the will of another, only metamorphosized like butterflies in your belly, like all you touch, you change. I know love is the catalyst, and this life is miraculous. I believe in you and me and magic. I believe love is the catalyst and life is miraculous. I believe in the intelligence of nature and the endurance of spirit. I believe if all of us commit our palms, our hearts, our minds, our lives to life, we will shape realities where all of us can thrive. Ashe.
Ashe.
Thank you so much, family. Ashe, ashe.